Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create typing paper foundation piecing blocks. These are the blocks we will create. Then I will show you how to create a boho bag using these blocks. So let's get started. Here's a list of supplies you will need for this project. I'm starting out using my leftover quilt binding strips, and I've chosen a color palette that I want to use. I begin by prepping my typing paper, just a standard size, 8.5 by 11. I'm going to start by folding one corner up so that it meets the side of the typing paper, and I'm going to just finger press that. The remaining strip on the end, I will cut that off. What you're left with is a block that measures 8.5 by 8.5, and what you've cut off measures 8.5 by 2.5. So now I have my paper foundation block. I'm going to randomly select my first strip. That will go over the crease that I already have. I'll lay it down right side up and I will pin it in place, making sure there's a little overhang on each end of the paper. Next, I'm going to select my second strip. You can color coordinate these strips if you like, one color on one side, one color on the other. I'm just going to randomly select for the crazy quilt look. And I'm going to place these right sides facing, making sure there's a little overhang, and I'll pin that in place. And I'll take it to my sewing machine and I'll sew 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll make sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end. And I'm also going to decrease my stitch length to 2.0. This will make it easier to remove the typing paper once the strips are all in place. And I'm also sewing with a quilting needle, 90-14. because I want to make sure that the paper is perforated, make it easier to remove. So now that I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance all sewn, this is what it looks like from the back. I have a little bit of overhang. I'm going to cut that off, and I will put that aside for now, because as you continue to cover your typing paper, your strips will get shorter, so you can use it later. With a dry iron, I'm going to press in between each strip that I sew on, and I'll continue to select random colors, right sides facing, pin it in place, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance until the entire piece of the typing paper is covered. Now this is what it looks like once the typing paper is completely covered. You can see that the paper is perforated. But before you remove the paper, we want to trim the block. Now if you have a little bit that's left of the typing paper that's showing, don't worry about covering that up. You can use a small piece if you like, but I'm not going to do that because it'll get caught in the seam allowance when I continue. So next I'll use my typing paper as my guide to cutting out my block. Using my ruler and my rotary cutter, I'm going to trim my block up. And I'll continue this process, and I will do 8 blocks to create my boho bag. This is what it looks like once it's all trimmed. And now we can remove the paper. So I start at one corner and I'm going to fold on that line that I sewed and just carefully pull the paper away. If you shortened your stitch length and you used a quilting needle or a top stitching needle, make it easier for the paper to come off. Making sure again to back stitch at the beginning and end of the seam. That way your stitches don't come out as you pull your paper off. This is what it looks like once all of your paper has been removed. If you have some little small pieces that are left, you can get some tweezers and pick that out. Use your fingernail. If your project is going to be washed, that'll just come out in the wash. Otherwise, you can just leave those little bits. Next, I have 4 blocks, and I'm going to continue to turning these to get the desired design. And don't worry if your seams don't meet up. Mine didn't meet, but that's not what I was going for. My strips are different sizes, so they didn't meet. But I wanted that crazy quilt look, and I was trying to create this diamond shape that's forming in the center. So now that I'm pleased with the shape that I have in my blocks, I will place my blocks right sides facing, and I will sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, again back stitching at the beginning and the end. Then I press my seams to one side, and now I will sew my rows together. When I sew my rows together, I want to make sure that my center seam is matched. And to make sure that they meet, I'm going to put a pin in one seam, make sure that that pin comes out that other seam. And then I will put a pin in that seam allowance to hold it down. Then continue pinning on my row, being very careful because some of these strips are on the cross grain and some may even be on the bias. So just be really careful so that you don't stretch out your blocks. Now that my rows have been sewn together, I'm going to press my seam to one side. And now I have my larger block that will form the base of my boho bag. So the blue floral fabric has already been cut to the pattern of my boho bag. I'll leave a link in the description on how to draft this boho bag pattern. And I've already found the center crease of that for the lining. And now when I laid down my larger block there for the base of my boho bag, it wasn't quite wide enough. So I sewed 2 strips of binding on either side that continued to form my crazy quilt pattern. And now I'm going to also take some binding strips and I'm going to piece those together to create the straps. And then with right sides facing, I'm going to sew the straps to the body of the bag. And then I press those strips, I press the seam up. And again, then now I lay down that entire part of the main body of the bag onto that lining. I'm using the lining there that I have cut as my pattern. So I'm going to lay this down, pin it in place to cut out the boho bag pattern. So now it's all pinned in place. I'm going to now cut it out. And you will need 2 of these panels, one for the front and one for the back. And you'll also need 2 for the lining. So now that my boho bag pattern is all cut out, I have 2, one for the front, one for the back. And I had to unpick that part of my rows because I'd lost that diamond pattern, and then I just re-sewed it to make sure I had the diamond pattern. So I have 2 for the front for the main body of the bag and 2 for the lining. So let's go ahead and prep our lining fabric. So to get started, let's insert our magnetic snap. So it comes in a set of 4. And then you'll also need 2 pieces of interfacing. I'm just using some upcycled batting. So take your lining and I want you to just do a fold to find the center, and I'm just going to finger press. I'm going to work from the back side of the fabric, and I'm going to measure down 1.5 inches center. That's where my magnetic snap will go. And then I will measure down 3 inches. That's where my pocket will go. And I'm marking on the wrong side of the fabric. Now to insert your magnetic snap, one piece of the magnetic snap set, that's the washer. It has a hole in the center and 2 slits on either side. So place your hole over your mark and you will mark those 2 slits on either side. I'll leave a link in the description for a closer view on how to insert this. But now I'm going to make 2 small snips on those markings that I made. Two markings that I made. That's where your prongs will be inserted. So I take one part of the magnetic snap that has the prongs. Working from the front side of the fabric, I'm going to push the prongs through those little slits that I made so that the prongs will come through the wrong side of the fabric. Do those same markings on your 2 pieces of interfacing and make those 2 small snips again. If you cut these snips, if those slits a little bit too large, then you'll just use 2 pieces of interfacing to hold your magnetic snap in place. But just be really careful and make smaller slits. So next I'm going to put my interfacing over first part of my magnetic snap. Then I'll take the washer and place that over the magnetic snap. Using the end parts of my scissors, the handle part, I just press those 2 prongs, one to either side. 1/2 of your magnetic snap is inserted, and you'll do the same thing to the other magnetic snap on the other part of your lining. So magnetic snap inserted on one side, the other half of the magnetic snaps inserted on the other. Now let's prepare our pocket. So I cut my pocket 6.5 inches by 7.5 inches, and you will need 2 pieces. I place these right sides together and I pin in place, but I'm leaving an opening of 2 to 3 inches so I can turn it right side out. And then I'll take it to the sewing machine, so a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I snip all 4 corners just to make it easier for turning, and I can push those corners out really neatly through the opening that we left. I want you to turn your pocket right side out, and you can use a turning tool to push those corners out. I'm just going to use my upcycled chopstick to poke my corners out, just being very careful not to poke a hole through. And then you take it to the ironing board, and I want you to press this really well, and then you'll top stitch at the top. And I usually increase my top stitch length to at least 3.0. So now both my pockets are completed. I'm ready to attach them to my lining. So on my lining, I'm going to first find the center part of my pocket just by folding, finger pressing, and on my 3-inch mark, I'm going to place the part that I have the top stitching at the top, pin it in place, and then you'll start on one corner, back stitching several times, go all the way around to the other corner, back stitching again several times, and attach both pockets, one on each side of the lining panels. Now that my magnetic snaps have been inserted on my lining, my pockets have been attached on my linings, I'm going to now put my lining part of my purse together. So with right sides facing, I'm going to pin my bottom seam. I usually start at the bottom seam just so I can remind myself to leave at least a 4 to 5 inch opening at the bottom so we can turn the bag right side out later. So you will sew from one end to that mark where you marked it for the opening, and you'll do that on both sides on that bottom seam. Then match up your side seam all the way up to the handle, pin everything in place, and then I'm sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you'll see you'll leave your opening at the bottom, and you'll sew all the way up the body of the bag, all the way up to the top of the handle. After your seams have been sewn, you will press your seams open, and then you will box your corners. Your side seam meets your bottom seam, making sure to match those seams up very carefully. Again, putting a pin in the bottom seam, making sure it comes out the side seam. And then I pin that seam allowance. And then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew that corner with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'll do that on both sides. So now that my corners have been sewn, I'm going to now trim my box corners to a 1/4 inch. This just helps to reduce the bulk. And when you turn your bag right side out, your lining right side out, your corners will be pushed out really well. So for now, leave your lining wrong side out, and we will prepare the main body of the bag. So you will take both of your main bodies of your bag and you're going to place them right sides together. And again, I start by pinning the bottom seam, and this time you will sew completely across the bottom seam. You don't leave an opening on the main body of your bag. And then you will match up your side seams and you're going to pin those in place all the way from the handle to the bottom of the bag, and sew 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end of each of these seams, and I'm sewing again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm pressing my seams open. Now on to boxing those corners. I'm going to make sure that my side seam meets up with my bottom seam. And again, by putting a pin in the bottom seam, making sure that it comes through the side seam. If it doesn't, just readjust. And then I will put a pin in both of the seam allowances on either side of that pin. I will take this to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to do this on both of my corners. So now both of my boxed corners have been sewn. Again, I'm going to trim this back to a 1/4 inch seam allowance to help reduce the bulk. And then we will turn the main body of the bag right sides out. And I'm going to push those box corners out. And this is what the main body of the bag looks like so far. So it's starting to look like a boho bag. So next I'm going to take my lining, which is wrong side out, and I'm going to take the main body of my bag, which is right side out, and I'm going to push it inside that lining. And then I'll begin by matching up the center seam on both my lining and my main body of my bag, and I'll put a pin there. And I do that on both sides. And then I will start pinning all the way around the bag, all the way up to the handle. But when you get to the top of the handle, I want you to leave at least 6 inches from the top of the handle. I want you to leave that part open. So you will start sewing 6 inches down the top of the handle, and then you will sew all the way around. I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. So there's 6 inches there that hasn't been sewn on both of the handles. And you'll do that on both sides, the inner seam and the outer seam. And again, you're sewing with 1/2 inch seam allowance. And once you've done that sewing, you're going to turn the bag right side out, and you're going to turn it out in that 4 to 5 inch opening that you left in the lining. So just take your time and turn your bag right side out. Push your box corners out on your lining, making sure that your handles are inside your lining. Push those in. And then you will start by pulling those handles out, right side out, and just take your time. And do this on both of your handles. So next I'm going to close the bottom part of the opening on that lining. Just push that seam allowance in, pin it in place. You can hand sew this or you can sew it by machine. I just stitch it by machine. So now the bottom part of our opening has been sewn shut. I'm going to now insert my lining into the main body of the bag. And then I will press. I want to make sure that the lining does not show on the other side of the main body of the bag. I then press that seam allowance in on the part of the handle that I didn't sew shut yet, and I do that on both sides. And I have pressed all of that bag all the way around, and again pressing the seam allowance in on both handles. Next, lay your bag out, and I want you to match the short ends of the handle so that right sides are facing, and you will make sure that that center seam, that it's matched up. Put a pin there, and you're going to sew the short end of your handle. This is the main body of the bag. Right sides are facing, 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, lay your bag out, and now you're going to make sure that the right sides are facing on the lining part of the handles, and we're sewing the short ends, again making sure that that center seam meets. Pin in place, and you will sew 1/2 inch seam allowance. So once those short ends are sewn, I want you to press that seam open on both the lining and the main part of the bag. And again, I want you to press that seam allowance in again, and do that on both the main body of the bag and the lining. So next we're going to sew one end of this handle to make sure that the seam is on the inside. I want you to turn that handle back onto itself until you can see the part that you stopped sewing on that handle, that 12-inch opening. And again on the other side, press it, pull it through, back onto itself so that wrong sides are coming out. And now you can see your seam allowance where you stopped sewing in that 6-inch opening. Put a pin there, and then you're going to match up that center part of the handle and pin along that seam. And then I want you to go to the sewing machine and sew, making sure to back stitch again at the beginning and the end. And this is what it should look like. Now pull it through so that right sides are out, and again I want you to press it, and see how I press it so that my lining doesn't show on this when I'm looking at the purse with my main body of my bag. So the next thing is to pin this in place. I want you to start at that center seam on the top of the handle. Again, pin all the way down to where you stopped sewing at that 6-inch mark. So it's 6 inches on each side. You'll take it to the sewing machine and you're going to top stitch. And you will top stitch both parts of this. Top stitch all the way around on both sides. And again, I increased my top stitch to 3.0. Feel free to use a decorative stitch on this part too. And your boho bag is all done. And this is created from upcycled quilt binding strips, or you can cut your strips yourself, and from upcycled pieces of typing paper to use as foundation. And your boho bag is all done. It's fully lined with pockets on the inside with a magnetic snap. I also added some decorative stitching on part of one of the bags that I created. You'll be able to see here a close-up. And this bag is available in my Etsy shop. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to purchase. And this is what it looks like. Nice and roomy. Magnetic snap makes it secure with your inside pockets. So I hope you like this project, and I hope you'll give it a try. Feel free to change the colors. I did my colors to match my lining. A great way to upcycle. Thanks for watching.